The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Situated in the Belaf Curraghs, the Curraghs Wildlife Park is home to around 70 species of animals from around the world. The layout of the landscape is themed, reflecting areas of the world where the animals originate from. As well as the animal enclosures, the park has a cafe, children's play areas and a miniature railway. Each year it welcomes between 2,500 and 3,000 children on official school visits to take part in workshops tied in with the school curriculum. But at the heart of the facility is conservation. 25% of the animal collection at the park is classed as endangered, critically endangered or vulnerable in the wild. Some of the most endangered are the silvery gibbons. There are only about 2,000 of the animals left in their native Java. Red pandas, of which there are only around 2,500 remaining in the wild, and gentle lemurs, of which there are only 1,500. But what are the origins of the park? Kathleen Graham is the general manager.
The park is just past its 50th anniversary by a couple of years now. So the park opened in 1965 and essentially it was in its conception seen as just a bird park and a wetland area. So it sort of quickly developed from there to have other animals, and people who remember coming to the park in the mid and late 60s may remember even things like an elephant. There was a baby elephant here for a short time. There was sea lions, and until not too long ago, I think 1980s, there was a sea lion here. So there's been quite a number of animals over the years, but certainly the idea of zoos back in the 1960s is very, very different to the zoo world today. It's come on enormously, I think, in its efforts and coordination in conservation, research and education. And in fact, even in the time that I've been involved in the zoo world since the kind of mid-90s, I've seen a huge move and change in how zoos are directing their funds and conservation and education.
That's an interesting point, because people's perceptions of zoos could be concrete floors and small cages essentially for animals, which you do still see in some parts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. A lot of people say, but you're not a zoo, you're a wildlife park. But essentially we are. We are a zoo, that's what we are. But wildlife park, I think people tend to think more open, more natural, and that's certainly how we are. But a zoo is a zoo in all its different forms. And for some reason, a lot of people still have this kind of 1960s, 70s perception of the zoo. And I often hear people saying things like, I don't really like zoos, but my local zoo is really good. And actually there's lots of really good zoos up and down the British Isles and in Europe as well. So we're a member of BIAZA, which is the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquaria, and there's now over 110 in BIAZA. So it's Chester Zoo, Edinburgh Zoo, Bristol, a lot of the smaller zoos as well, Shreppreth. We all coordinate, we know each other, a lot of the directors and curators and keepers too. We have meetings, we know each other, all the animals are loaned, swapped, borrowed, so there's no monetary value put on the animals because their value to conservation is priceless. And I think that's one of the things that's really helped drive zoos forward, is that concept at the heart of it, is that these animals are not for monetary gain. These animals are precious to our planet, and that is why we all work so hard in the area of conservation and education.
And in terms of the changes there has been, that sort of evolutionary process in zoos and the ways animals are treated, is that down to legislation, or is it mainly been moulded or shaped by public opinion and changing public perceptions of animals?
I think it changes from all regards. It comes from people, doesn't it? And sometimes the best people to work in the zoo industry are ones who are slightly zoo sceptic. It's because it's driven within. And I think it's partly the changes in the zoo world have been driven by keepers, curators, marketing people, directors. It's the people who work for the zoo that make the changes, but they're also absorbing the public opinion around them as well, and they're constantly getting feedback. And I think zoos have always strived to become better and better. And yes, there's good legislation there as well. But for example, being a member of BIAZA and EAZA, the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, of which there's over 400 zoo members, we are above and beyond the basic legislation. So in the British Isles, it's the modern standards of zoo practice, and there's the basic standards there, but we are seen to be above that. So for example, when EAZA sent their 5 accreditors to us in 2016, which was quite a nerve-wracking process to be re-accredited, because it's not done very often, sometimes you do think, well, gosh, are we up to standard, what if we're not? And they could have put us back down to being temporary members, or even removed us from EAZA completely. So it was quite a nerve-wracking process. But we were so pleased that we did pass. They said, yes, you are a worthy member of EAZA, you are up to standard. However, there's always some recommendations that come as well. And you welcome that. You welcome the chance to have the feedback and to continually improve. And I think that's what we're trying to do at the park. But we're also doing it as part of a whole zoo movement as well that spreads throughout Europe.
What criteria are there to get that accreditation? I mean, what do they come and look at? You say it's quite intimidating for them to come over. What aspects of the park or the management of the park do they inspect?
Well, I would say all aspects, and you need to be educating. That's a key cornerstone. It's about education, not just of schools and school children, but of your general public as well. And we have sneaky ways of doing that, our What's On guide and our talks and our touch tables, although they're entertaining, they are there as well to sort of educate and to broaden people's perceptions and to get them thinking about wildlife and our planet and connecting to it. So, by connecting they care. So very much on education, what are you doing for the schools? What are you doing public education? You're also looked at what are you doing for conservation, as in, what money are you raising and what conservation projects are you involved in? The animal care has to be of the highest standards, so you need to be providing good diets, you need to have qualified and experienced keeping staff, you need to have enclosures that are designed with the biology and the needs of the animals in mind, you need to have good health and safety. So they're looking at all that, and they're also looking at your financial viability, because if you're going to be taking endangered animals and homing them, for example, our gibbons, for up to 35 years. They don't, want to be loaning, swapping to zoos who are about to go bust, and that then puts that animal in a precarious situation. So they're looking at everything really. So it was quite a nerve-wracking process, but I think it was a very good one because it allows you to benchmark yourself and check, how are we doing? And the answer was good, but there's always room for improvement. So I think, we're still striving to be the best that we can be, because we may be seen as a small collection, being from the Isle of Man, but we have some important animals here. We have an important part to play in the world in conservation, and very important for the island schools and people here, because not everybody can afford to go across annually, to some of the bigger zoos. So to be able to connect to animals here and understand how they fit into the whole grand scheme of things and the planet is a great thing. So it was a nerve-wracking process, but it was a good one.
And you said that in all these sort of assessments, you're likely to come out with the assessors saying there's always room for improvement and make recommendations. So what recommendations did they make the last time round?
They were pleased with the improvements we were making at the penguin enclosure, because bearing in mind this was 2 years ago, so we hadn't fully completed that. They were quite keen on us improving the cafe, and we have got plans on that to try and move the cafe to the front of the park and really modernise that, because that will help, increase our ability to bring it, if you like, off-island money. For example, during MGP and TT, when the park can be quite quiet, having the facility there on the edge of the park will really help. Maybe even being able to use it as an evening venue. So that helps with the financials of the park. Yeah, they commented a few things. For example, some of our back areas maybe weren't quite so well, screened off. I suppose it would be Isle of Man, we can be a little bit more relaxed about security and things like that. So I guess the assessors did notice that sort of more clearly marked paths and areas for the public to be. So yeah, and again, we're quite keen on staff training and to be able to send keepers away to things in the UK. That's quite important, but it is difficult when you've got a small team and then, that one event you've planned, it's a storm and the boat doesn't go. So it can be difficult to kind of fit that training and connection in. But I'm quite keen for the staff to have that ability to still go and connect to other keepers and learn and share information, because that's really where the enthusiasm comes from, and the knowledge. The sharing of knowledge is such a great thing in the zoo world. It's so open, and everybody's quite encouraging to help each other out and share what knowledge they've gained to help species as a whole.
I mean, there must be changes all the time in practices and approaches to things. So keeping up to speed with that must be, I suppose, a constant process.
Yeah, and we're lucky that the fact that we being a member of BIASA and IASA, we have access to their websites, the member part of the website. So, for example, IASA has regular meetings. The annual conference, unfortunately I can't go to this year, but the annual conference is just about to happen, and all the TAG groups meet, and TAG is Taxon Advisory Group. So they organise all the stud books, so there'll be a stud book keeper, and these are just people who work in zoos, and they take that work on, usually doing it over and above their day job. So they do need to have a bit of time during work time, but a lot of people individuals will actually put in a lot of their own time into organising their stud books. And these are so that we can keep the genetic populations healthy, the genes as wide as possible. But the taxon advisory groups also look at where do we need more research. Is there an issue here with that diet? And they organise research so that we can further improve husbandry. They organise conservation efforts as well, so that it will be highlighted. There may be a specific need for a conservation in a species and how it can be helped, and certain zoos may partner with each other to actually put people out in the field so that they are running that project. So I mean, zoos are now the third biggest conservation contributor in terms of money and resources. So there's a massive amount going on, and that is all because the zoos talk to each other, because it's coordinated, and these meetings are full of people talking over ideas and possibilities and then making things happen. So yeah, it's a much bigger picture than people realise. It's not just this little wildlife park here in the Isle of Man.
In terms of conservation, you're involved in various breeding programmes for endangered species. How does that work?
Yeah, so for example, it often depends on the species. For some stud books, for some animals, there may be a reasonable amount of surplus, and IASA and BIASA zoos will put up on the websites what animals they're looking to rehome and what animals they want. If it's a stud book, for example, something like the silvery gibbons, that's not just I want that animal, you can have it. You have to consult with the stud book keeper, and the stud book keeper may have conditions in place. They may want to see your housing plans, they want to know, what you're going to do for conservation, and there may be prerequisites that you have to meet before they will make that recommendation for that animal to go to your zoo. So one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is golden lion-headed tamarin, or golden lion tamarin. One of the two, they're both got equally high conservation status. So, I've already talked to the tag and the stud book, and they said, yeah, that's great. We'll send you out all the paperwork, we'll start the conversation. Technically, all the golden lion tamarins and golden lion-headed tamarins still owned by the Brazilian government, so they need to okay you. So that process has started, so that may be 2 years, before we see that animal in the collection. So you can't just shop on eBay for your next animal, and that's often why it's not as simple as just replacing an animal when an animal dies. It can take quite a long time, and we're also have not just our collection plan in mind as in what we would like and what's suitable for the wildlife park. We have to bear in mind the European collection plan, and that is there's highlighted animals that are like, this is quite a high conservation need, we would like zoos to have this animal. This animal, although it still exists in zoos, we don't really think we should be keeping because it's numerous in the wild, it doesn't need our protection, and maybe the genetics of what is left in the zoos isn't great anyway. So they're effectively saying that animal should, over a few years, disappear out of zoos, and this animal should come in and replace it. And an example of that would be our Canadian otter or North American otter. We now have one single female, and she's one of only 7 left in all of the European zoos. But in North America, it's quite a common species. It doesn't need our help. So the recommendation is for smooth-coated otters, and they're an Asian species of otter, and that's also in the pipeline for us. That's been in the pipeline now for nearly 2 years, but I reckon it's going to be at least another year before we get the enclosure ready for that species of otter. So that species of otter will replace our North American or Canadian otter, if you want to call her that. She's now 16 years old. Generally in the wild, they live to 14. They can live up to 20, but she's just a little arthritic. She will live out the rest of her days, but we will not be getting more Canadian otters. We will be getting smooth-coated otters in a new exhibit when the time comes. So that's how we are fitting in to the overall conservation plan, if you like. It's not quite as simple or straightforward as people think. It's not just, we'd like to have that animal, we'll get that animal.
I mean, you used the Canadian otter as the example there. In terms of deciding not to have something in captivity anymore because it's plentiful in the wild, it's a case of waiting for the ones that are in captivity to die out rather than trying to release them back into the wild.
Yeah, no, you releasing captive animals is highly complex issue. You wouldn't generally release something wild. I mean, there is room for common, if you want to call them, species in zoos, and there's a number of good reasons for them. One is some animals can jump from least concern to endangered literally overnight. So it's not always a bad thing to have some of the more popular or common animals in zoos. Something like meerkats, that's a classic example. Now, meerkats are not endangered. There's plenty of them in the Kalahari Desert. But they are such a great animal for education, and they also are an animal that can help pull visitors in, so that you are helping more endangered animals that maybe people aren't so bothered about seeing. So there is a reason for zoos to keep some animals that are not endangered. Also, meerkats, I think, can have a very successful life in captivity. So there is a need for that. But for example, if we didn't want to keep our meerkats anymore, we wouldn't ship them out to Africa and let them go. Because they've spent most of their life in captivity, they've maybe had it a bit easy. That would be completely unfair. It would be like releasing your pet at home out into the wild and going, on you go, you can look after yourself now. So you have a duty of care to animals in captivity, and they often have a very good and successful life. It's just a bit different maybe from a wildlife. For example, the gibbons that we have here, the silvery gibbons, they have a great island here where it's quite peaceful. It's open top, they've got a great view, they can swing through the trees, they've got a nice big house which is heated in the winter, it's warm and dry, it's actually bigger than my house. So it's not a bad life. They have their food provided every day. It's a bit like, I suppose, staying in a hotel. The difference with that is, though, maybe they don't quite get the same challenges, so there can be some boredom. So keepers have got to think of ways to keep them busy, keep them active, not always make their food so easy to get to, make them work for it a little bit. So they are able to have a family here. So they've got Finlow, who's now over a year old. In about another 18 months, we could expect to see another youngster. They can have a really successful life here, and that gap between babies is about 3 years in the wild. Here it should come down to about 2.5 years because they have the resources. So it's a really successful life for them, and they'll stay as a family unit as they would in the forests of Java. Now, in Java, they've got poaching to deal with. Adults are often killed so that the baby can be taken off the mother and sold into the pet trade. They have forest fires, illegal fires to clear the forests for palm oil. So they have all that to contend with in the wild. So on balance of things, I think to myself, if I was a silvery gibbon, would I want to be out in the forests of Java, or would I want to be here where I've got a nice safe home, where I know my food's provided for me? And on balance, it could be a winner being in a zoo for some animals. So it's not a bad life at all, it's just slightly different. It's a bit like some of us maybe have lots of money and lots of foreign holidays, and some of us have to work a bit hard. But maybe the person, the farmer who works hard, isn't necessarily unhappy, and neither necessarily is the person who has lots of skiing trips. They're probably quite happy too, but in a different way.
And in terms of the stud bookkeeper matching animals, you said in certain cases with species there are a limited number in captivity in that breeding programme. How are the animals matched so that you don't have problems genetically?
Unlike breeding for pedigree, you tend to narrow the genes because you're breeding for certain physical aspects of an animal. It's the opposite in the zoo world. You're trying to keep it as diverse as possible and mix it as much as possible. Years ago, when I used to work at Edinburgh, I was the stud bookkeeper for warthog, and I remember two animals that used to pop up all the time called Boble and Noble. And Boble and Noble seemed to have been the root cause, the pair that had bred the most, and their genes were spread through about 90% of the stud book. So for me as a stud bookkeeper, I was really trying to breed the 10% that weren't parented from, traced back to Boble and Noble. So you have those issues as a stud bookkeeper, so you're trying to keep the population as genetically diverse as possible. But the stud bookkeepers have all sorts of tools at hand. The zoo world has got probably the best record keeping system. All the animals go into a programme called ZIMS, and it's there in the cloud. So I can actually look up and see what Cincinnati Zoo has in their collection. I can open up each animal and see where their history is. I can look at their medical records. So you have that resource. So when you're maybe trying to look up a medical problem and one of your animals, you can go on to medical ZIMS and see what have been the other medical issues, how did they deal with it, what anaesthetics did they use. So we've got this massive resource there in sharing. So the stud bookkeepers have all that, they input all that data as well. So they're looking to keep the population as diverse as possible. So the silvery gibbons, for example, there's only about 43 in the European stud book, so they're a growing programme. The stud bookkeeper will maybe set an ideal population, so they can actually look at the genetics and say, what is the ideal amount of genes we're trying to retain here. And you usually can't retain 100%, but you aim for something like 95 or above 95% over a 50 or 100 year period. And they're looking to make the matches that will keep that gene diversity going, so that you're not losing genes. And that's the interesting thing, is that some of the populations of species in zoos are actually genetically more diverse and therefore more robust than wild populations, because they're being fragmented and often their gene pools are actually narrowing, which then reduces further their chance of thriving in the wild. So all that learned information in zoos can also be applied to studying populations out in the wild as well. So it's massive how zoos have come on.
And even when you match animals within the breeding programme, I don't suppose you can ever guarantee that there will be offspring.
No, there can be all sorts of issues. I remember there was a time we didn't have gentle lemur babies for a long time, and Sarah, one of our keepers, had went off to Durrell. She was on a Calatricid course there, and she spoke to the stud bookkeeper who's based at Durrell in Jersey, and she changed it from a conversation and speaking to her. When she came back, she changed the diet, and a year later we had our first gentle lemur baby. So we've got one at the moment, and he's still doing great. So there's things like that. So sometimes it's little things. Sometimes little tweaks or changes can make the difference in breeding or not breeding. But it's not always about breeding, because the stud bookkeepers actually sometimes have a problem placing animals. There's only a certain amount of space in zoos, and where a stud bookkeeper has said, okay, we need a population size of about 200 to sustain 96% gene diversity over the next 50 years, they may actually say, actually, we need to stop breeding. Or, we may have an animal which is further down the mean kinship list, as they call it, and that's kind of like the ideal genes. So pairs are matched. If they're at the top of the mean kinship list, it means they're they're the best ones to breed. And if you've got a pair who are halfway down or down near the bottom of that league table, the stud bookkeeper may say to you, actually, I don't really want you to breed. So you may have to prevent breeding, and that may be through contraception, or it may be just keeping the animals apart at a time when they would breed, which is often quite a common way of dealing with it, because some animals don't live, in fact quite a lot of animals don't live in pairs. They will only come together for breeding. So something like our fish and cat, for example, they wouldn't live as a pair. Our fish and cats live separately, and we would only put them together for breeding. So if the stud bookkeeper says, actually I don't want you to breed this year, then we don't put them together.
We'll continue our conversation with General Manager of the Curraghs Wildlife Park, Kathleen Graham, after the break.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
On this week's programme, we're finding out more about the island's wildlife park and the part it plays in the broader programme of animal conservation, from General Manager Kathleen Graham. So just how do the European breeding programmes within zoos translate into preserving or expanding animal populations in the wild?
Well, many zoos run their own projects, as well as zoos partnering together to run projects. A lot of the bigger zoos have quite a number of projects. They fund completely themselves, they staff completely themselves, and so it's about connecting the animals that we have here with a conservation project out in the wild. We're not big enough yet. We don't have the resources at the moment to run our own project, but this is the great thing about being a member of BIASA or IASA, is you link in with other people and partner with them. So for example, the silvery gibbons, the Aspinall Foundation, who run Howlett's and Portland Zoo, they're IASA members. They are the main keepers of silvery gibbons. They have half of the population, European population, at their zoos, and the stud bookkeeper is also based there. They run the Javan Primate Conservation Project out in Java. Now they have a safe region of forest that they protect. They have a centre there where they rehabilitate gibbons that have been stolen from the forests. That's the ones where parents are killed and the babies are prized off and sold into the pet trade. When authorities discover these animals and confiscate them, they go to the centre there and they spend about a year rehabilitating them back out into the forest, and they rehabilitate langurs there as well as the gibbons. Now the Aspinall Foundation hope that if they can keep that region of forest safe, and if the numbers will allow, they may even look at using some of the captive animals within Europe. So it's not impossible that Finlo, our little baby gibbon, might actually end up in Java eventually. If not, he will stay in a European zoo. He'll leave home at the age of somewhere between 8 and 10, and he'll be partnered with a female, and he'll have his own family here. So it's actually running conservation projects out in the wild. But as well as that, it's all that data that's collected by zoos, all that medical information, all the DNA sampling. There's a lot of that work going on as well, the very scientific stuff that can help in the future. You know, there's things like the frozen ark, there's all these kind of things going on. So there's a plethora, if you like, of projects that are going there to support projects out in situ, you know, where they are. And yeah, sometimes we contribute to other people's projects. I think it would be nice in the future to say, yeah, we'd like to run our own project. But there's maybe projects here in the Isle of Man that we can run as well, you know, and maybe partner with other partners in the Isle of Man. So, and we do sort of look after part of the Ramsar site here, you know, that's on our site. That's a wetland of scientific interest. So, yeah, that's how we play our part.
How many species of animals are there at the park?
We're around 70 species.
That's quite a diverse range of animals and birds to look after. I mean, how do you keep tabs on the health of all of them, the finer details of how to care for animals like that?
It's a daily never-ending task, is it? You know, the keepers, it's like Groundhog Day, you know, it's sometimes just, you know, you're loading, you've got to make sure that we've got all the right foods in. So we've got a large walk-in freezer, a large walk-in fridge. We have to order in a lot of frozen fish to make sure that we don't run out, and we need to make sure that we've got all the appropriate food there. You know, we have Robinsons delivering to us every other day just about, you know, topping up the fridge. So we've got all our foods there. We've got our dried zoo foods, so there's specific pellets designed for things like rheas or different primate pellets as well, leaf eater pellets. They're all designed for zoo animals, so that's all bought in. So we've got all the correct diets. We keep track of dietary improvements, or as research happens, and keep our diets in line. We have Argbane as our veterinary provider, so they're out regularly doing a check on how the animals are doing, and obviously we call them out if there's any specific issues. So we need to plan routine veterinary stuff, but we also sometimes have to react to the odd emergency. An animal may become ill or injured. Macaques, for example, can be particularly nasty to each other and cause injuries, or animals become old and arthritic and they need a bit of attention. So there's the daily keeper rounds of feeding, cleaning, checking. We're always looking back to, are we keeping up with modern practices? Is our veterinary, providing all the veterinary needs? And it's also about recording that as well, as keeping that recorded so that you know where you are.
What's the risk of disease in a place like this for the animals? Diseases, conditions that might be specific to any one species?
Fairly limited. We're particularly in the British Isles, we're pretty hot on keeping diseases out, aren't we? We're an island, and we tend to like to keep various diseases like foot and mouth and various things out. So there's a lot of screening before we move any animal into the collection. There can be a lot of checks, and so the vet in the government department, when we're bringing something in, as well as checking that we need the correct CITES paperwork, if it needs CITES paperwork, we also check to say, well, what do we need before we bring this guanaco in from Poland or this otter in from Germany, and they will advise. It may be that they want specific blood tests taken and the animal screened pre it arriving, and it may be that animal has to be isolated for 30 days before it comes to us. It may be an isolation or a quarantine when it arrives. So zoo animals as well, there's a lot of work done to keep diseases out, so I'd say we're pretty hot on it compared to, say, for example, domestic animals that often get moved about, or even sometimes, pet farmers, they'll move animals in without even really realising that they need paperwork for animals. Tortoises and snakes and all sorts of things end up in the island because people didn't even realise that they needed a permit to bring them in, or health checks before they were brought into the island. So whereas we're obviously very aware of that, and we make sure that we are doing everything right.
As a buzzword at the moment is Brexit. Will it have any impact on the wildlife park and its dealings with other zoos in Europe?
Yeah, it might do. Nobody seems 100% certain what's going to happen, and certainly in the zoo world there's been quite a bit of talk about that. And the good thing is EASA actually has a permanent employee in the European Parliament who does a lot of lobbying on exactly these kinds of issues, and making sure that the European politicians understand the importance of zoos, why we need to move animals around, and if you like is in there to for zoos' interests, so that we can keep these animals flowing for conservation purposes. So there is talk in there about how that's going to happen. So we don't think that it will stop animals moving from the UK to European zoos, but worst case there might be a temporary stall on it until everybody sorts out just what paperwork to do. It can be quite confusing knowing which paperwork to get and how to go through that. So I think there will be a bit of a change there when we come out of Europe, and it may cause a bit of confusion. It might cause delay to some animals being moved around, but I would hope that it's not going to, prevent us from moving animals or make it overly difficult. But yeah, I guess we just need to wait and see. I know certainly the government department has been doing work on that and preparing for, the various scenarios. So there is work going on behind the scenes, but it's still a big unknown, isn't it? There's a lot of unknowns, isn't there, to Brexit? We just need to sit it out and see.
In terms of moving animals, the logistics of that must be interesting. Keeping them in the right conditions, not too stressed out. How do you transport an animal from one zoo to another?
Well, there's lots of guidelines again. You've got IATA, there's very clear guidelines on crates and, how the animal needs to move around, what breathing circulation you need. So you always make sure that your crate, your transport crate, conforms to IATA and other guidelines. We can do some moves ourselves. If it's a UK move, sometimes, a staff member at the park will go and collect an animal. When it's across, from Europe, we'll usually use an animal transporter. And there's actually a number of people, it's their business, that's what they do. And there's a few that are specialist in zoo animals, and so they also help sort out the paperwork as well, particularly if you're crossing a few borders. If you're coming from just outside of Europe to in Europe to out into the UK to over to the Isle of Man, it's handy to use a transporter because they know the paperwork system in and out, and they can help sort all that. And they have the specialist vehicles as well. So, for example, there's one company we use quite a bit, and he has all the refrigerated van, so it's temperature controlled. And he can plug it in, even when it's on the ferry, to keep it at just the right temperature. So, for example, last year he brought us over 6 penguins from Beauval in France. And I think it was about mid-June, 2017. Anyway, it was right in the middle of a hot spell. So he'd had to drive up through France. I think it was about 34, 36 degrees in France when he left. And it was hot right the way up through the British Isles. And even when he got to the Isle of Man, it was still hot. And he said, of course, the penguins were absolutely fine. They'd been in a nice, cool, air-conditioned van the whole way. I said, how have the penguins, are they okay? Have they coped? He goes, they've been fine. They're nice and cool. He said, however, I've been sweating in this cab for 36 hours because unfortunately he didn't have air conditioning in the driver's cab. But the penguins were comfortable, and that was the most important thing, as I reminded him.
And you've been at the park now as general manager for around 6 years. I mean, there have been a fair few changes over that time. What have been the biggest developments here?
I don't know. Ask other people. There's change is always happening, isn't it? It's always going on, and we're always trying to make improvements. I think when I first arrived here on Island, my son was only 2.5, and I've always joked that he's my little focus group. And, I think we really did need to improve the kind of facilities here for families, to use the park regularly. And certainly things like the jumping pillow has been so popular. That's been in 6 years now, I can't believe it, but that's always been so popular. And the play areas, and before, when I was completely childless, I never quite understood why parents would say, when I worked at Edinburgh, there was more playthings needed. I think, why do you need playthings? You've got all the animals. Surely the animals is enough to entertain them. But then you realise actually it's not. Kids need to play, they need to be outside, and they need that connection. So it's great that parents can bring the kids here. They can run about, they can jump on the jumping pillow, they can play in the enchanted wood. If it's raining, they can be in the soft play area. But they're still absorbing the animals, even though it doesn't feel like it. And I know, because when my son was only 2.5, 3 years old, he didn't seem to have any interest in the animals whatsoever. But as they become regulars to the park, as they get a bit older, they tend to show a bit more interest. I mean, some kids just are never that way minded, but often they do. And I think if you give them that chance to be here and be in that environment, that love and that connection can spark something from quite a young age. So I'm a great believer in that the park is for everyone, whether it be kids, granny and grandpa, whether you don't have children. You don't have to come here because you're passionate about wildlife. You can come here just for a nice day, but it is our job to leave people with something, just that a spark or connection to an animal, or a bit more understanding about a conservation issue. So that's what we're here. But there's nothing wrong in coming here for just a nice day out. So I think that the membership did increase as we put more playthings in, and then I think was the time to really start focusing on the animal collection, because I think there was talk 6 years ago, was the park outdated, should it still be here? And I think absolutely it should still be here. It needs to be here on very many levels. For one, we're open 300 days a year, and possibly, it's not impossible that we could go to being open literally every day of the year at some point in the future. So it's an important facility for islanders, for visitors as well, something that's open all year round. We educate all the primary school children here. We educate visitors whether they like it or not. They might think they're just coming on a leisure day, but we try and get some information into them while they're here. So the park works on so many levels, and we really are lucky to have this park here, because as a population of just, sort of around the 85,000, it's a bit bigger than what you would expect, really, but it works on many levels. It's about the diversity, I think, of the park, and even using it for events and community as well. We haven't even touched on all the corporate groups that come here and give back by helping put climbing frames up for some of the primates, or doing all sorts of projects around the park. So, and work placements as well, young people looking to be vets or to go get into conservation careers, we can offer them sort of internships, volunteering, things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's sometimes can feel like you're climbing a mountain, and I still think we're very much at base camp, but you know what, we're heading to the top, and I'm determined that we can make this park even better than it already is. Yeah.
How much interest is there from the younger generation these days in things like zookeeping?
I think more than ever. I mean, when I started as a zookeeper, it wasn't really a career that was up there or particularly on the radar. Now it's highly competitive to get into zookeeping. I think there's the younger generation, now that I'm a bit older, they definitely are really very concerned and very caring about the planet. I think they're more aware ever of the issues and the pressures. So I think that onus on having a career which can really contribute, that you can contribute something back to the world, something that feels really worthwhile, is very attractive. And, working with animals, that always has been a kind of popular career choice, to work with animals. It's not always the best paid job in the world, but it can feel so rewarding. And, on a nice sunny day, there's nothing better than being a zookeeper. Bit different in the middle of winter when it's blowing a gale and pouring with rain. That's the downside, but I think the highs, if you like, outweigh the lows. So I'd say that there's definitely more interest in zoo careers, and they've diversified, because 30, 40 years ago you were a zookeeper and a curator, and that was it. Whereas now there's research, scientific positions in zoos. There's much more education, diverse roles in education, from straightforward teaching to sort of presenting, and there's careers in zoos where you might spend some time in the zoo and time out in the field, in projects. So there's lots of diverse careers within the zoo, and even within zookeeping. You've got your good traditional zookeepers who are just great animal husbandry people. They're instinctive. You've got people who specialise in animal training to improve the husbandry and reduce stress in animals when you are doing veterinary procedures. You've got people who are maybe slightly more scientific side. So even in the type of animal keeper you get, there's more diversity there to kind of fulfill or be strong in certain areas. So yeah, it's definitely a very popular career choice and highly competitive now.
You mentioned the highs and lows of the job of being a zookeeper, and certainly here at the park there have been highs and lows this year. I mean, in April there was a fire and you did lose some of your newest animals.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely in the time that I've been here the lowest day, I think. And the keepers were absolutely gutted. They did a terrific job at getting here and managing to save the adult pair, and who have now gone on to give birth again. And little baby Phoenix is still doing great. We're still waiting on the rebuild, but they will be back out hopefully by the end of the year or into the new year. But yeah, I mean, that was definitely a low day. And it is, when you look after animals, there's always the ones that are really going to get you. The times like that when you just feel, I don't know, it was the worst way to lose any animal. I mean, over your career as a zookeeper, you probably look after hundreds of animals. When I was at Edinburgh, it certainly was a huge collection, and you look after so many animals, but there's always some that get to you. There's always some that stick in you, a bit closer in your heart. And there is something, a tragedy like that, it hits you like somebody punching you in the face. I say it time and time again, the fact that the keepers were here that night, managed to get on site and get the adult pair out was great. And little Phoenix, who was born after the fire, was, testament to the fact that we managed to save the adult pair, so their genetic line wasn't lost. So we are rebuilding the enclosure. It's not rebuilt yet. Our gentle lemurs are still off show, and Phoenix is doing well though, so hopefully to the end of the year or beginning of year we'll get them back out. But yeah, I mean, that was a real tough day, and there's always some tough days, if you lose an animal that was a bit close to you, and or just days sometimes, when there's a storm and you come in and you think, oh gosh, what state's the park going to be in. It's great in the summertime when the weather's lovely and everyone thinks it's a wonderful job at the park, and it can be, but in the middle of winter when it's pouring with rain and windy, it can be quite tough working outdoors. But I think if you ask anybody, really, it's the animals that's what the highs outweigh the lows, certainly, for sure.
General Manager of the Curraghs Wildlife Park, Kathleen Graham. And the park is open daily between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. during September and until 5 p.m. in October. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be back at the same time next week.